So do you guys know, you may not have ever seen them, I saw in movies and stuff. Say DNA, one way to say is the blueprint for life. What is a blueprint? This is technically not quite a blueprint, but it's the idea.
It's like instructions, but it's like an image of instructions. Like.
Yeah. There's some blueprints. More blueprints. So blueprints are basically instructions, a very detailed picture that, for example, somebody building a house would have a big, not just like a little drawing on a sheet of paper, but a big set of blueprints that go through system by system, tell what the foundation is going to be like, what the structure of the room is going to be like, the heating and ventilation system, the electrical, the plumbing. It has basically every single detail about how that house is going to be built is specified in those blueprints. By looking at those blueprints, if you can read them, you'll know exactly what the house is going to be like, exactly how it's going to function, and so forth. That's sort of what DNA is to a living thing. It has all the instructions about how to build a living thing, how it works. That's contained in the DNA, in this molecule. It stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. That's a type of molecule. And that's where the letters DNA come from. It's a very long molecule. It's very linear. It's very sort of straight, almost like a line. Okay? And this very, very long molecule is found in our chromosomes. And our chromosomes are found in the nucleus of our cells. What's in the nucleus? And they're made of DNA along with some proteins as well. In one segment of a DNA molecule, we call it a gene. It has a specific set of information that tells about one characteristic. So somewhere on one of your chromosomes, there's a gene that determines your hair color. Okay? And there's another gene somewhere else, maybe it's on the same chromosome, maybe a different chromosome, that determines whether or not you have freckles. And so there's all these genes, hundreds of thousands of them, that determine how our bodies work and what it looks like.
Does it take multiple genes to figure out if you have it?
Yeah, there's multiple genes involved in hair color. Yeah, in almost everything, there's like several genes, like eye color as well. It's not one simple gene. It's a couple different genes, and they all sort of interact to make your eye color. But those are some examples of genes.
Fortnite.
Why is this here?
Blueprints.
Yeah, you're going to build something, and about those blueprints, and then yeah, you got a big pencil in your hand. Not sure what they do with the pencil, but Jaden?
So how much DNA do you have in like each chromosome?
Like a number? Like
Is it random?
so I have no. You have a certain amount. So in one cell, this is later on in the slides, but I'll explain now. In a single cell, if you're to take the nucleus, take the chromosomes, take the DNA, and make the chromosomes, and like store all that information, it would be 3 gigabytes. Like if you know anything about computers, like 3 gigabytes of storage on your phone or something. You know what that is. All those pictures you could store with that. But that is how much information we have in our chromosomes. And that all fits in the nucleus of a single cell. All that information is there. So it's very compact and it's very dense, all that information. And we're going to talk in a minute about, like, okay, well, how is a chemical, this molecule, how does it have information that makes us who we are? We'll talk about that in just a second. So DNA was first really identified in the 1950s. Before then, scientists didn't know the structure of DNA, what it looked like. they had ideas about it. They also knew, that the nucleus was involved in inheriting these traits. Mendel didn't know anything about DNA at his time. He came up with his ideas about genetics just based on reading those pea plants. And the people that are credited that won the Nobel Prize for discovering the structure of DNA, what it looks like, these guys, Watson and Crick. And they built this model. This is like a famous picture of Watson and Crick, James Watson, Francis Crick. They built a model that showed the double helix structure of DNA. Okay? And they won the Nobel Prize for that. There's actually somebody else that was important in this story. We'll watch a video maybe at some point. Another scientist, so there were several sort of possible shapes of the DNA molecule that lots of scientists thought might be the shape of the actual molecule. And they had different versions, and they were trying to figure out which one. Watson and Crick were building models, but there's another scientist who took pictures of a DNA molecule using X-ray crystallography. And one of these photos ended up being given to Watson and Crick. And they then used that photo to say, oh, this is the model. And they used that as a big part of their evidence to build this. This person didn't really get credit for that discovery at the time. And her name was Rosalind Franklin. She's now famous, but lots of people say that she got sort of overlooked in her contribution to the structure of DNA. Especially at this time, women in science were not as common as they would be today, but also did not get respect for their work oftentimes, and did not get the credit that men in the same field would get. And so I'll show you a video about Rosalind Franklin, but she had a big contribution as well to what this molecule is like. She didn't get the Nobel Prize, however. Watson and Crick did. So Watson and Crick figured out the shape as this double helix. It's like a spiral staircase, sometimes called a twisted ladder. That thing that when you see it, oh, that's DNA. That's called the double helix. It's two strands winding around each other with these steps sort of in the middle. If you think of it as a ladder, you just twist the ladder. That's the shape of a DNA molecule. And so the outside, in this diagram, this blue, that's sugar and phosphate. Okay? But then the rungs of the ladder, that is where the important information of DNA is stored. That's where these codes are. The genes that we have are stored in those rungs of the ladder. Because those rungs are made up of 4 different possible things that we call bases, nitrogenous bases. The bases are called adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And so your DNA has millions of those letters, one after the other after another. And the order that your letters are in, the order of A's, T's, G's, and C's that you have, is different than the order somebody else has. And that's what makes you different from somebody else. The order that these letters are arranged tells your cells how to build you. Has the genes for all of your various traits, and how your body functions. It's all stored in these letters. A, T, G, and C, millions of them.
Can someone have the same order as you but be different?
Sort of. So, who has the same bases as another person? Identical twins. Only identical twins. And even theirs may vary a little bit. But identical twins are identical because they have the exact same DNA. So if you know identical twins, are they identical in appearance? Pretty close, right? So what do our genes control about us? Pretty much all of our appearance is dictated by our genes. How our body functions is controlled by our genes. But there are also other factors, environmental factors that change how our genes work. If two people have the exact same genes, identical twins, and this is one thing that scientists study very closely. It's how they've learned what is genetic and what's not. Is they study identical twins that were separated at birth, maybe given up for adoption and adopted by different families and were raised in different places by different people and had different experiences. And when they look at identical twins that were separated, things that they have in common are most likely controlled by their genes, because they have the same genes. For example, if twin A loves broccoli and twin B hates broccoli, does that mean our preference of broccoli is genetic? No, because they have the same genes. If we're controlled by our genes, they would like the same foods. So they look at sort of are they the same height? Could be, but might not be. Because our height is controlled partially by our genes, but also by our nutrition and what we eat as we grow and things like that. So there's this, both factors come into play. But most of our appearance, most of our body works is controlled by our genes. How about personality? That's maybe not so much. Part of your personality and your characteristics might be genetic in nature, but other parts are based on your upbringing, on experience that you have during your lifetime. Those things can change your personality as well. So that's one of those things that's not quite clearly genetic.
I guess what I mean is are there only 4?
Yep.
So what if mine was TGAC and someone else was TGAC and we weren't related? Is that possible?
Oh yeah, because lots of
Yeah,
genes
that's what I mean.
are the same because you have millions of these.
Yeah,
So some sections of yours are the same. Even if you compared, if you were to go all the millions of DNA bases, compare you and your dog, more than half of them are going to be the same. Because you're both mammals. And so lots of your genes are the same. Obviously there's a lot that are different because you're not a dog. But yes, if species are closely related, they have more similar DNA than farther related species. Who do you share the most DNA with?
Your parents.
Siblings. You and your siblings share the most DNA in common. And if you branch out, you share a lot of DNA probably with your first cousins, maybe a little bit less with your second cousins, and the farther you go, the more differences there are. The same thing through evolution.
I think you did the wrong test. I still did it, but I didn't know.
So, these bases. These bases.
Some of the questions on there are the same.
Yeah, there are some that are the same, but.
You should still grade that one.
There you go. I'll give you a new scan try. All right. So these bases. So we have the sides of the ladder are sugar and phosphate. The bases are the steps of the ladder. And there's 2 bases make up each step. Okay, and when they match up, the bases align themselves in a certain order. They match up. They are complementary to each other. And the way they line up, adenine always matches up with thymine. We say they're complementary. And therefore, what other 2 must go together? Yeah, guanine and cytosine go together. So they match up. They bond together based on hydrogen bonds between each other.
Is it a difference between a T bond with A or is it always A bond and T?
A and T or T and A together. So if you need any help remembering apples and trees, cars and garage, will help you. But it's not that hard to remember. So if we know 1/2 of a DNA molecule, then we can figure out the other side of the DNA molecule. If I know these are the bases on 1/2 of the DNA strand, A, T, A, what are the bases that are going to go along with that?
C, G,
T,
C,
T, A, T. What goes here?
A, G, T.
So A and T always together, G and C always match up.
C.
A and C.
Wait.
How do you not go?
What? No, A and T always match up together, and C and G always match up together. Because of the structure of the molecules.
Would they give us like T, C, A, and then would they know which one matches up?
Yep.
Oh.
So this is what it looks like if you sort of draw a diagram. We have phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, same thing on the other side. Those are the sides of the ladder. And then the bases, which are matching up with each other, T with A, C with G. And so the order of those letters, that's our genetic code. You may have ATA, TCA, TGC, GTG, and that's part of the gene that gives you freckles. A person that doesn't have them may have similar letters, but there are some differences, which result in a person not having freckles. Okay? So these letters are the part that store information. Combination of letters you have, the A's, T's, G's, and C's, determine your traits. So it's just 4 letters. It's like an alphabet that's made with, instead of 26 letters, just 4 letters. But you can still have infinite number of combinations because you just keep adding more and more. And even only 4 combinations, you end up with a huge variety of traits. So if you think about the bases of DNA are kind of like letters. Put together different groups of letters, you form words. Put together a bunch of different words, you can form sentences, and so forth. Go.
What if a person had no DNA?
They can. DNA is in every cell. So, what DNA actually is, a gene is really a recipe that describes how to build a single protein. That's what a gene really is. It's the instructions about how to build one protein. And proteins are super important. Proteins do all the work of the cell. The cell's made mostly of protein. Hormones are made of protein. Proteins are what our body is made of, mostly. And so, different proteins that are made by our genes form different traits. Now, DNA is found where in a cell?
Chromosomes.
It's in our chromosomes in our nucleus, but it's actually stuck there. DNA is trapped inside of the nucleus. But where are proteins made? Ribosomes, which are not in the nucleus, they're outside. So, we're not going to get into the details, but the DNA makes a copy of the recipe in a molecule called RNA and sends it out to the ribosome so it can make it. Now there are times when there are errors. So every time one cell divides and makes 2 cells, the DNA needs to be completely copied. But sometimes errors happen. We call those errors mutations. Mutation is a change in the genes, change in the DNA of an organism. There's a few different types of mutations. So as the DNA is being copied, every once in a while, a letter gets swapped by accident. It was supposed to be a T, and instead an A was put in, or a G, or a C was put in. We call that a substitution. We substituted one letter for another. Sometimes, as the new DNA molecule is being built, an extra letter gets put in. We call that an insertion. Other times, one letter gets left off. We call that a deletion. And so if we change the letters of the DNA, we change the gene. And a gene is a recipe for a protein, so if we change the recipe, we might change the protein, and that can have effects in the body. One example of this is a disease called sickle cell disease. So we know in our blood, in our red blood cells, we have this protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein that actually grasps onto oxygen. That's how our blood cells carry oxygen. And so somewhere in our chromosomes, we have a gene that tells our body how to make hemoglobin. Well, in some people, this gene has one base that's been switched. And because this base got switched, the protein hemoglobin that they make is different than normal hemoglobin. And this different hemoglobin has an effect in the cell. What happens, it can't grasp onto oxygen, and it changes the shape of the blood cell. People that have sickle cell anemia, some of their red blood cells look like this. This is how a red blood cell should look. This crescent shape. And so that's a problem, because these sickle cell shaped red blood cells don't carry oxygen. They tend to clog up capillaries and lead to swelling. They lead to extremely painful conditions. People that have sickle cell disease have these bouts when they're have extreme pain, and it can be fatal. And so having this change in the DNA causes all of these problems. I think I mentioned in one of the classes a disease called cystic fibrosis.
Yeah.
It's caused by a single gene that got switched. When the single gene got switched, the protein that makes the mucus in the lungs is too thick, and it traps bacteria and leads to lung disease in a person by one of these genes being wrong. Now usually, when cell DNA is being copied, there's also special cell machinery that double check that it was correct. And if there's mistakes, sometimes our cells can find mistakes and fix them. But sometimes they don't. And that's a mutation.
Are these blood clots or?
They don't, not blood clots, but just the misshapen red blood cells. Joe?
Is that how like twins don't come identical?
Sometimes. So twins might not be identical because as their cells are being copied, mutations may come about. Again, if you're copying millions and millions of bases, there's going to be errors that happen.
Do we ever?
Now, sometimes those errors lead to beneficial things happening. Like if they could lead to something positive, then natural selection would encourage that. But lots of times they also, the changes lead to a negative effect. So it depends. Now, there's an interesting story with sickle cell anemia. It's most common in people of African descent, probably because the first time this mutation cropped up was in Africa. Lots of genetic diseases are more common in certain groups. Sometimes it's based on geographic location, sometimes based on ethnicity, sometimes based on religion. Because if you think about it, people tend to marry people that are similar to them, of the same religion, or live in the same area, or the same ethnic group. And so that's why certain diseases tend to be more common in people of certain like characteristics. The interesting thing about sickle cell disease, it's a recessive disease. And so if a person gets two of the recessive genes for this, they get sickle cell disease, and often don't survive into adulthood very far. But if a person is heterozygous and has just one gene, some of their red blood cells are this shape, but most are not. But it actually gives them an advantage. The advantage is that they are less likely to get malaria. So people that are heterozygous for sickle cell anemia actually have a resistance to malaria. So you could see that in a tropical location where malaria is a major problem and affects millions of people, it's actually beneficial to have one of the genes for sickle cell disease because it protects you from malaria. It's still not an advantage to get sickle cell disease because it causes so many health problems, but it is an advantage to have one of the genes.
So it'd be heterozygous, it's better to be heterozygous than just be
Yeah.
full.
Yep, in certain areas where malaria is pronounced.
Well,
Perfect.
What are like the common diseases in like all races? Like Caucasian,
Yeah, it depends. Like like Tay-Sachs disease is common with Eastern European Jewish people. It just sort of depends on the traits on sort of different diseases.
A substitution, like wouldn't the to like line things up fit?
Like not match.
Yeah, well, because as they're making a copy, if one gets changed, then as the new DNA molecule, the other one also gets changed. Is there something else I want to mention? All right, so just to finish up here, to review, DNA stands for what?
Oh,
Deoxyribonucleic acid. Deoxyribonucleic acid.
You think why? That's why you want to say it?
No.
I don't know.
The shape of a DNA molecule?
Don't
Raise your hand, please. Matt? Double helix, twisted ladder. Who are the scientists that got the Nobel Prize for discovering the structure of DNA? Joe?
Greek and Charles.
Watson and Crick.
Hello, Watson. Seen that motion?
Yeah.
The four bases?
A, T, G, C.
Or EC.
Thymine, T, adenine, A, guanine, G, and cytosine, C.
Doesn't matter what order you're
Doesn't, the order doesn't matter.
Oh, okay.
A always pairs with
T.
Bella
Oh,
and Bella, G with C.
Yeah.
Raise your hand if you can give me the complementary strand of this. Colton?
GTAATC.
Correct.
GTAA.
Sophia?
Does it matter? Do you actually know what the four bases are?
Not really.
Oh.
All right, to finish out, I'm just going to show you this
Wait, all these guys have freckles?
little video clip about genes. It's this right here.
Wasn't that?